The must be abolished to save the planet.
If you don't play their game, then the jackals will come in and assassinate you.
This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a fact, you know?
They have been called blood-sucking assassins.
We weren't helping the poor get better lives. We were helping the rich get richer.
There's one institution that makes leaders vanish.
The most dangerous institution you've never voted for.
This is the nerve-wracking story of one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Not a military, not a government, but a bank. A bank with no flag, no borders, no accountability. The International Monetary Fund. What is the IMF really? Why do entire countries despise them? Why do leaders fall silent or fall altogether after they speak out? To provide exclusive insights into this organization, we interviewed Alex Gladstein, the Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. With his help, we sought for answers. Let's play a game. Do you see a pattern? Kwame Nkrumah, president, revolutionary, author of Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, a man who believed Africa's chains hadn't been broken, just rebranded. He warned the world, the IMF is not here to help, it's the financial arm of empire. But Ghana's economy was crumbling. The IMF came with a rescue offer, and Nkrumah said no. 1 year later, February 1966, he boards a plane for Vietnam. While he's gone, his government falls. The military seizes power. Nkrumah, invisible.
Outside Parliament House, home of Ghanaian democracy, every trace of the dictator's statue is removed.
Within days, the new regime embraces the IMF's terms and signs the deal. And Western capital flows back in. Chile, December 1972. President Salvador Allende stands before the United Nations.
There have been efforts to isolate us from the world, strangle the economy, and paralyze the sale of copper, our main export product, and keep us from access to sources of international financing. We are the victims of a new expression of imperialism, more subtle, more sneaky, and terribly effective to block the exercise of our rights as a sovereign state.
He accuses the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Shortly after, he nationalizes US-owned copper mines and dares to dream of an economic order built on sovereignty, not suppression. But justice doesn't come. Jets bomb the presidential palace. Allende dies with a rifle in his hands. The military takes over the power, and within weeks, international credit lines reopen. Markets breathe a sigh of relief. Fast forward to January 1998, Indonesia. President Suharto, the IMF's loyal enforcer for decades, suddenly pushes back. Fuel subsidies? He won't cut them. Family monopolies? Off limits. But resistance comes at a cost. And the cost got too high. A single image travels the world, humiliation frozen in time. It's not a negotiation, it's a performance. One man signs, the other watches. 4 months later, riots engulf the streets and Jakarta begins burning. Shortly after, Suharto resigns. For years it all looked like coincidence, but the files were waiting. In Ghana, American officials discussed Nkrumah's removal. In Chile, they funded the opposition, orchestrated economic sabotage, kept close ties with coup plotters. In Indonesia, US pressure on Suharto came not through weapons, but through numbers, spreadsheets, and interest rates. These weren't just collapses, they were takedowns. What links these three leaders? Each challenged the economic world order, each stood in the IMF's way, and each disappeared. How can an institution with no soldiers, no flag, and no accountability bend nations to its will. Imagine you're the leader of a nation. Let's call it Imagistan. Your local elite, drunk on power and imported champagne, live in guarded compounds. Their nights, fueled by cocaine and wealth hidden in Swiss bank accounts. The people, different story. Your currency has collapsed. Inflation rages. The shelves are bare and your people are starving. You didn't start this fire, but now the house is burning and they're all looking at you. Your ministers lean in, their voices low, their advice identical. Call the... 3 letters, 1,000 implications. You're told it's your only hope, but we all know when you're desperate enough, hope is dangerous. A smiling diplomat arrives, clean suit, clean shoes, and a sharp mind. He offers a rescue package, fresh capital, technical support, all delivered in a loan agreement. It feels like a salvation, and it's just one signature away. But is it really salvation? And who are they really? Let's rewind. 1944. The world is still at war, but victory is coming.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Their mission? Never again should currency wars spark conflict. Never again should countries fall alone.
Summing up the importance of Bretton Woods, Mr. Vinson says,
"Ours is a mission of peace, designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation."
The United States leads the effort, triumphant, rich, and unscathed compared to Europe. But seated at the table are men with visions far beyond victory. Franklin D. Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, declares,
"We have come to recognize the poison of economic nationalism. This will be its end."
And the great economist John Maynard Keynes? He calls it nothing less than the brotherhood of man. From that dream, 2 institutions were born. The World Bank, to rebuild bridges, cities, and physical scars, and the IMF, to rebuild something even harder, trust. The IMF would stabilize currencies, prevent manipulation, and be the lender of last resort. Its promise? To help members in trouble, without shame, without punishment. A cooperative monetary system where every country, rich or poor, could lean on each other in times of need. A firewall against chaos. This was more than economics. It was idealism made flesh. And for nations scarred by war, it felt like hope written in the language of money. But history doesn't preserve dreams, only actions. Because even in 1944, the room wasn't equal. Power sat heavily on one side of the table, and while the ink was still drying, the balance of the world was already tilting. Our country, Imagistan, is not the first, and it won't be the last. He is just 17, shot in the face by a soldier. Not in a war zone, not in a gang fight. No, during a protest. It happens in Cochabamba, Bolivia, April 2000. His name is Victor Hugo Daza. But this isn't just about a boy killed in the street. This is the story of what led to it. An economic experiment, a foreign doctrine, and a bitter medicine prescribed by the economic doctor, the IMF. It's the late 1960s and Bolivia is politically unstable but economically booming. Tin is its treasure, oil its promise. The resources make up more than half of Bolivia's export income. Flush with petrodollars, their military dictatorship borrows like kings. Infrastructure, imports, arms, ego.
And then they sort of like addicts, they keep borrowing. No one's telling them to stop, and we're like dealers, we're happy to keep giving the debt.
But it is a house of cards, and in 1982 it collapses. Debt balloons past 100% of GDP. Then tax revenues collapse. The solution? Print more money and more until a loaf of bread requires a sack of bills. Inflation hits 11,000%. This isn't a crisis anymore, it's a coma, and a doctor is needed. In the halls of power, one name keeps echoing: International Monetary Fund. But the IMF doesn't send normal doctors, it sends reckless surgeons, not to rescue, but to perform a shock therapy. August 1985, Supreme Decree 21060, signed by President Victor Paz Estensoro, scripted by Harvard economist Jeffrey Sachs. Only after Bolivia agrees to slash and burn its entire economy, the IMF opens its doors. Fuel prices triple overnight, wages are frozen, price controls abolished, and the mines, over 20,000 workers fired in one stroke. No pensions, no retraining, no future. People like Carlos are left with nothing, a miner now jobless. But even worse, his son was sick and needed medicine. Actual medicine, but now the clinics cost a lot of money. Carlos is excluded from public support systems. The IMF calls it economic innovation. Privatization isn't always evil. There are great, positive examples. But what happens when you sell life itself? In 1999, Semapa, Cochabamba's public water utility, is sold. The buyer? A foreign consortium called Aguas del Tunari, led by Bechtel. This wasn't just water, it was control. All sources, even community wells and rainwater, were now subject to billing. Overnight, water bills soared. 100%, 200%, some families saw 300% increases. Carlos can no longer afford water for his own teenage son, Victor. The people fight back. Students, factory workers, farmers, united under one name, Coordinadora. February 2000, they march. They block roads. They demand water be returned to the people. But the government responds with tanks. Martial law, and shortly after comes the moment that would change a country forever. On April 8, 2000, Victor Hugo Daza is shot dead at 17 for defending water. His blood stained the pavement and the water never looked clean again. But the story didn't end in Cochabamba. Bechtel wasn't done. They sued Bolivia for $50 million for profits they never got to steal. They filed with ICSID, the World Bank's shadow court, using a treaty loophole in the Netherlands. The country that had just buried its children was now expected to pay their killers ransom. Protests exploded in San Francisco, Spain, the Netherlands. Activists chained themselves to Bechtel's HQ. Finally, the company surrendered. They walked away with 30 cents. Bolivia was not alone. The IMF offered cures, but again and again, its surgeries and side effects were deadly.
What the IMF and World Bank really do is exploit poor countries for their labor and resources. And it's kind of like a neo-colonial mechanism.
Victor was shot. Carlos never recovered. And Bolivia? Bolivia was forced to sell its soul and body just to survive another day. Whose crisis is it really? If you've thought about investing and trading on the capital markets but are too scared of the risk, our free community group is the place to learn and take that first step. We have started a free group where we're working with an ex-Wall Street trader whom I know personally, so if you're ready to stop following the crowd, and especially in these volatile times like now, you have a massive opportunity to capitalize on all that crazy stuff that's going on in the world. And if you're ready to do that and to learn how the elites and the big boys, the big institutions are moving and copy their exact moves, check out the link to our group in the description below. And by the way, this is the first version of this group. We will add much more value, free downloads, cool analyses and so on in the coming weeks. Just give us a little bit more time. Slavery was abolished. Colonies declared independence. But what if the chains didn't vanish, but they just changed form?
And basically what the bank and the fund did was replace the weapon of the sword or the gun with debt. And the way that they would do this over time is by working with dictators.
Control once came through conquest. Today, some argue it comes through contracts, not through war, but through loans with strings attached. They call it liberation, but
what you had was a system of extraction, almost like a giant vacuum machine, vacuuming up the resources of countries and stripping away the ability of governments to even tax corporations that were involved in those extractive industries.
There is a terrible irony here. While the rich world lectures the poor on the importance of preserving the environment, the IMF and the banks tell the people of the Philippines they must export in order to pay off the debt. But all they have is their fragile earth, its minerals and forests. So the earth must pay the debt.
For many, it is just neo-colonialism in a three-piece suit. And at the center of this new empire, the International Monetary Fund. A debt trap starts simple. A country borrows, it struggles to repay, so it borrows more. Then comes the IMF, with rules, with conditions, and austerity. And the trap tightens.
We then find ourselves in this kind of situation where we are capital deficient, and because we're capital deficient, we then have to borrow. Not unlike the situation of like a low wage worker who is exploited and extracted, and they have no choice but to go to a payday lender, as is the case in the US. We go through these cycles of debt, and that debt, like you were saying, Eugene, is used as a mechanism of control. It's a mechanism of subordination.
Debt becomes the new weapon, stripping away any room to maneuver. Governments must choose between servicing their loans or funding hospitals, schools and public works. And when they default, that's when the IMF steps in with its so-called rescue package.
He decidido iniciar conversaciones con el Fondo Monetario Internacional.
But what happens when the medicine becomes the poison? Take Argentina, once among the wealthiest nations on earth. Fertile land, black gold, a thriving middle class. But wealth wasn't protection. Decades of corruption, military coups, and ideological whiplash turned promise into chaos. It's 1976 and a brutal dictatorship seizes power. Tanks on the streets, bodies in rivers, but behind the violence, something quieter. Debt, $12 billion in private sector loans, secretly transferred onto the public books. The people would pay. The elites, they walk away clean. Then comes hyperinflation and people get their money out of the country. And the humiliation of the Falklands defeat, a short but bloody conflict between Argentina and UK over the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. Argentina is bleeding, but the doctor is already waiting. The IMF arrives like a savior, a lender of last resort, but also a gatekeeper. The loan comes, but so does the contract, and that contract, it would define the next 3 decades of Argentina's fate.
¿Qué lo preocupa a usted?
El país, señor. La situación. ¿Usted no?
The contract pushes what they call structural adjustment. While it comes with the promise of funding, for most people it felt more like structural punishment and a return to the old days.
We've transformed the old school imperialism with cannons and rifles or bow and arrows or what have you. We've transformed that into debt imperialism, basically.
This is Eddie's structurally adjusted neighborhood, which periodically gets bulldozed to make room for more rubbish.
Public assets end up sold, social spending gets slashed, and subsidies are erased.
Nunca más el Estado incursionando e interviniendo en áreas que no le corresponden.
All in the name of efficiency, all in the name of stability. But instead of healing, Argentina spirals. In 2001, Argentina defaults on its debt payments.
Queremos conseguir un crédito stand-by del Fondo Monetario.
Middle-class savings vanish overnight and pensions are frozen, all while poverty is exploding. 19 years later, in 2020, Argentina needs another restructuring, another crisis. Despite all these years, the cycle had never ended.
But in fact, the public institutions have received a total of over $1.3 trillion. The reward is to be more than 60% more in debt than they were in 1982.
As the debt remains, so does the pain.
Hace algunos minutos el Fondo Monetario anunció un programa inédito para la Argentina.
And after all this development, one question remains: who really profited?
Economic growth and financial stability makes the world a safer place.
As protesting against
and economic policies affect people. Price of groceries to education,
deal with the International Monetary Fund,
jobs, and prospects for the future.
The promise of the IMF is enticing. It just feels like hope and prosperity. But then they hand you the fine print. When the IMF steps in, it brings more than money. It brings rules. Reforms are negotiated not in parliament, but behind closed doors, with unelected technocrats and with officials in Washington.
I think it is critical to understand the dominant role that these institutions play. Often, governments are more responsive to the interests of the World Bank or the IMF and the demands of those institutions than their own parliaments and legislatures. It is actually stripping away the democratic process.
They call it conditionality, a sterile word for something much colder: cutting healthcare, freezing wages, selling public goods. It's austerity with a spreadsheet, and the pain is never evenly shared. In Argentina, poverty jumped repeatedly, between 37% and up to 58%. And suicides among poor populations? Of course, they surged. As public services fall apart, the fire sale begins. Electricity grids, telecom networks, railways, privatized in the name of efficiency, snapped up by political insiders and foreign corporations. Across Africa and Latin America, Citibank and Chase quietly take over plants and refineries, financed by the very loans they pushed in the first place. The consequences on the ground were severe. And while hospitals closed and villagers rationed electricity to avoid blackouts, Wall Street toasted to debt equity swaps and their successes in emerging markets. This vulnerability attracted a new breed of investor. Hedge funds like Paul Singer's Elliott Management purchased distressed sovereign debt not to offer relief, but to intensify pressure. They began suing nations already crippled by IMF-mandated policies. These were not reforms. They were transfers of wealth away from the people.
Critics of the IMF say it is outdated and ineffective. Of the 89 developing countries that received IMF loans, more than half were no better off afterwards. In fact, 32 were poorer.
But here's the part you rarely hear about. These deals, they don't just allegedly bail out and then drain countries. They also make the original lenders feel
safe. The multilaterals are safe, the commercial banks are safe, the bilateral countries are safe, but the people of the third world are not safe because they continue to pay a debt.
And that is what many consider the unspoken truth of IMF policy. Suffering is socialized, but profit is privatized.
I think we definitely need to focus on those rules that have been made and say these are very bad rules if we are going to determine what is a good rule by what it does to ordinary people.
Founded on the great idea of international cooperation, why does the IMF stick to those controversial rules?
Why have they deployed these policies? Is it because they haven't got the knowledge to understand how to really go about rebooting these economies?
The designers of those policy recommendations for developing countries are very smart people. They do understand key concepts and key realities.
So who are they serving?
Well, you just need to look at the result. The result has been that developing countries have consistently been suppressed in their economic development, and their resources have been extracted very efficiently and very cheaply for the benefit of the industrialized countries.
Those smart policies aren't accidents. They reflect whose interests are actually being served. To understand why the IMF keeps pushing rules that undermine ordinary people, we have to look at who makes those rules. The IMF is owned by 190 countries, but it doesn't act like a democracy. It acts like a shareholder club. Votes aren't equal, they are based on quotas. The United States holds over 16%, enough to veto any major decision. Europe and other rich nations control most of the rest. Meanwhile,
guess what the representation for Africa at the World Bank is today? Two executive directors representing a continent of 54 countries, right? So the imbalance in the governing structure is clear.
The IMF expands executive board with addition of 25th chair.
Even though the IMF recently announced slight changes, the pattern is clear. The global south borrows, the global north decides.
Their primary utility is power, not necessarily profit. It's to control societies.
Frustrated by the imbalance, countries like China and India are pushing back. BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, new rules, new institutions. The message is simple. If the IMF won't change, we'll build something else. One might think the IMF has already peaked in power, but it strikes hardest when countries are weakest. During COVID, they encouraged governments to spend big, but buried in the contracts, a promise to tighten the belt once the cameras left. Subsidy cuts, wage freezes, VAT hikes. Even during a pandemic, they said build back better, but many built back broken. No bombs, no invasions, just numbers. But make no mistake, this is war by other means. What if the rescue was the trap?
I think Western society, America, Europe, and beyond, I think will be so much healthier in a world without this system. And it will be less predatory, less exploitative. It'll be more dynamic. I think it'll be more resilient. It'll be more moral.
There was a time not long ago when cash was just cash. No politics, no tracking, no digital ID. It worked without batteries, without Wi-Fi, without anyone watching. For the undocumented, for the elderly, for victims escaping abuse, cash wasn't just payment, it was protection. As economist Lars Feld once said, cash is printed freedom. But in the pandemic era, that freedom started to look inconvenient. The virus spreads, but something else spreads faster. Fear.
Money changes hands all the time, but can it carry the coronavirus? The short answer is most likely.
You pay with credit or cash? That's a phrase we've heard a lot, but since the coronavirus outbreak, you might be hearing a little less of it now, and instead businesses might be saying card only.
Suddenly, cash was obsolete, unsafe, and into that fear stepped a solution: contactless, seamless, traceable. This was a paradigm shift, because when crisis strikes, systems change. Enter central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, programmable, trackable, permanent. With CBDCs, every purchase is recorded, every transfer is saved, and every movement is mapped. They promised inclusion, efficiency, modernization. They say CBDCs are for the unbanked, but who's building them? MasterCard, Visa, and IMF consultants with ties to major fintech funds.
We would not want a world in which the government sees in real time every money transfer that anyone makes.
And yet, that's exactly the world we're building. These central bankers call themselves independent technocrats, but they aren't neutral, and they aren't elected either. Yet, they are among the most powerful people on earth, and each time they fail, they emerge with more power, from interest rates to unemployment, from mortgage rates to digital currencies. Central banks or institutions like the IMF are no longer just regulators. They are architects of the everyday. Should we be worried? As legendary economist Milton Friedman put it, CBDCs alone are powerful, but combine them with far-reaching AI, you get programmable, predictive, and punitive money. Spend $50 on fast food? The algorithm remembers. Donate to a protest? Flagged. Miss your behavioral quota? Access denied.
By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food.
That's not money, that's a leash. While the public debates privacy, the IMF is already building the infrastructure. Over 130 countries, representing over 98% of our global GDP, are involved in CBDC implementation. Many have turned to the IMF for CBDC design and strategy. They are not just recommending policy, they are setting global standards. And in the background, a more ambitious plan, a digital version of their so-called special drawing rights, the IMF synthetic reserve currency. Borderless, again programmable, and potentially post-dollar. Make no mistake about it, this isn't some conspiracy. It's their official roadmap. The IMF claims it's here to stabilize the world. But what happens when the stabilizer becomes the architect of the cage?
A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations, and also we will have the technology to enforce that.
What started as public health might push us towards permanent surveillance. And the world's most powerful institutions, they're not watching from the sidelines, they are writing the code. Once, freedom came folded in your wallet, but now your money will be flagged, frozen, filtered, denied. This isn't about what we're gaining, it's about what we're letting go. And the most important question isn't whether CBDCs will come, it's whether we'll realize what we're giving up before the door closes.
Ultimately, it's up to you all, right? It's up to you all to create a generation of new economists that will be able to stand against a model that has failed.
If you find the IMF's plans disturbing, you're not alone. But the story doesn't stop here. Now it's time to follow the money. Click here to uncover the staggering $68 trillion power play Larry Fink and BlackRock are quietly orchestrating behind the scenes.